Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please take your seats at this time as the program will begin momentarily.
Thank you very much, Marcus. That's right. Thanks for that introduction. I'm actually calling from Brighton in the south of England at the moment, 1 hour's difference. But as you rightly said, Marcus, we all spent COVID doing something very different, no doubt, than what we were doing before COVID. And I took the time to write this book on artificial intelligence for learning. Most of what I'll say is in that book, and then a second book on learning experience design, which is how to design this stuff with this newer technology in mind. Because I think as we are in our second going into third year of COVID, we're getting to feel how education will change in the future. Well, online education in particular. The biggest change will be in workplace learning. I mean, AI, artificial intelligence, has changed the very nature of work. So it will absolutely change and is changing the nature of workplace learning. Remember, most learning takes place not in universities or in schools, but when you get a job and you're in your workplace for the rest of your life. With learning experience platforms, learning record stores, the application of artificial intelligence, we'll come to that in a minute. In fact, the Gartner report, which was written just 2 months ago, shows that about 80% of classroom training, traditional training, will not come back. It will not come back. So the online market has gone through the roof. And I was involved in a company that just got bought for 150 million. We thought it was worth 50. Suddenly it's 150 because the smart money, of course, is heading in that direction. But something else interestingly happened during COVID, I think, just to start with a case study. And that is, you may have heard of Duolingo. And if you haven't, then it's a language learning program. Very simple, on your mobile, on your laptop, tablet, whatever. And it's had about 500 million users. In any 1 month, there are 40 million users. Remember, there's about 26,000 students at TU Delft. So that means that Duolingo has 1,500 times more active students than TU Delft. 1,500 more students. And they're avid, they really do stick with this. I know a friend of mine, 565 days he's gone for a road, doing it every day on the streets. But it's a good example to start with because I think it points to the future in terms of the use of AI. So Louis von Ahn, who was the Guatemalan programmer, is an artificial intelligence guy, and he will tell you straight off that Duolingo is really an AI-driven learning system. That's why it's so effective. That's why it's free. But it uses AI in all sorts of clever ways that give us a hint to the future. First of all, it builds in pedagogy. So we know from Ebbinghaus in 1885, so it's 130 years ago or whatever, that we forget most of which we learn. So even although I'm giving this talk to you now, you will forget most of what I'm going to say. That's science, folks. So these modern AI-driven systems know that forgetting is part of the learning process. In fact, the breakdown and subsequent retrieval actually improves learning. Funnily enough, we're finding in cognitive science that actually forgetting turns out to be a rather good thing because you have to retrieve things to reinforce them. You look at there's a very good book on this by Carey in 2015. And they use really smart maths, really smart AI behind the scenes that is completely invisible. You don't know it exists. They started with a simpler box system so that if you forget a word, it goes down a box. If you get it, it goes back up a box, called the Leitner system, up and down like a ladder. They then went on to half-life regression, which is a much more advanced AI technique. That's all based on gathering real data from remember, 500 million students have used this system. So the data set is enormous and can be used to train the models. So Duolingo, funnily enough, gets smarter. It's a learner itself. The platform is a learner. And then on motivation, because motivation is the big issue in learning a language, it has some very clever notification systems. So it's constantly prompting you or putting social pressure on you to take things further. It's always trying to spot when you're coming off the curve, when you've lost interest, and trying to get you back on. In fact, their most powerful notification is what Louis calls the death notification. In other words, if they see that you've been learning a language for 3 months and then suddenly you take a bit of a dip, they give you that final warning saying, come on, you've come this far, keep going, keep going. You've invested all this time. If you just make that little bit of effort, and of course, people come back up and continue. So it's a combination of good pedagogy, motivation, good science. That's why 40 million people are on that thing today. It's enormous. This is the way things will go. And the important word here is personalization. Duolingo personalizes it. So, me, Donald, if I'm learning German, Russian, Arabic, whatever, I get a personal experience. It knows where I am, what I'm getting wrong, right down to the level of a single word. It has a huge database of words I've been exposed to, and then it has a guess, and it guesses off into the future on how long it will take before I either forget it or remember it. So, an incredibly clever system in that sense. Now, other things have been happening, and another example I really like is Eric Mazur, who teaches physics at Harvard. He's been teaching physics for several decades now, but he was quite famous for transforming the lecture away from a standard 1 hour presentations. We only have 1 hour because the Sumerians had a base 60 number system. It makes no sense to do an hour in anything other than that. It's nothing to do with psychology of learning. But of course, Eric Mazur did something quite clever. He stopped his lectures every 5 minutes. Remember, these are lectures in physics, because he found that kids were memorizing the maths and not understanding the physics. So he would ask a natural language question, and if the majority, they just had cards in their hands, if they got it wrong, they would get them together to do peer learning and then wait till everybody was brought up to speed, and on they go. Transformed lectures. This system has been used worldwide for many years. However, during COVID, he went completely online. And he has a great line here. He said that he's never been able to offer a course the quality that he's offering now online. And he is now absolutely convinced that there's no way he could do anything close to what he was doing online in person. He actually has come out and said online teaching is better than in person. In fact, he thinks it's almost unethical to go back to the lecture room, that it would be a wrong thing to do. And the reason for that is he did some interesting work in lecture rooms showing that the students at the back of the room tended to get lower scores. So there's a correlation between where you sat and your final attainment in the exam. But his line on this is, of course, when you are online, every single student is in the front row. You can pay attention, personalize the attention, give feedback to every student if you have good systems. So I think there are people who are suddenly realizing that if you do online well, and I don't mean just jump on Zoom and add a few quizzes, which is what 90% of the emergency stuff was. When you do this well, you use AI, you use clever, smart systems, then it all starts to make sense. I think also COVID gave us all an increase in digital literacy and skills, not only among students, but teachers. Suddenly, I think teachers, lecturing is easy. This is easy. Lecturing is easy. Teaching is hard. And when you have to make that step change, I think you up your skill level, not only in teaching, but also in digital literacy and skills, which is good for the students as well. So, it makes sense. I think there's also a pendulum swing towards the learner in online learning. You'll find that last year I was not last year, 2 years ago before COVID, I was in Stanford with some medical students and faculty. And when we asked the students what tools were most popular in terms of their learning, there were two at the top of the list, and they were Google and YouTube. This surprised faculty, of course, because about 40% of students don't turn up to lectures anyway. That's a fairly global average figure there. So, and if you're interested in the study, there's a very important study done at Harvard on this. Because the world has changed, students can be more autonomous because they have search. They can find things. They can find online journals. When I did postgraduate work, I had to wander up and down a library to find physical journals. It took forever. We have a massive increase in efficacy because of online access and search. And of course, they're going to YouTube videos. Even people doing abstract subjects, like my son has a degree in artificial intelligence. He was using AI all the time, YouTube all the time, to get straight from the horse's mouth the best person in the world who knows about that particular algorithm. This is the way learners think these days. So your learners are already embedded in AI. And of course, because it changes the very nature of work, it will throughout their lives now. All your students looking into the future, it changes the way they will learn. It changes the world, so it changes why you learn, your very motivation for learning. A lot of this stuff's on YouTube or Google. You might not have to store it in long-term memory. It changes what we learn, when we learn. It's free from the tyranny of time and place, and also how we learn. And that's what I want to address now, the sort of how we learn things. Okay, so I think AI is undoubtedly the defining technology of our age. The top 8 to 10 companies are all AI companies, whether it's Amazon, Google, Twitter, Facebook, Bad Eye, Tencent. They're either in America or China, but they absolutely dominate the stock market and what we do when we're online. So there is no doubt that AI dominates the world of IT now, going off into the future. But it's interesting to think about how AI affects us, because we're in a sort of nexus of AI every time we go online. I mean, how often do you use Google or Google Scholar? All the time. Pure AI. If you're on Netflix, mediated by AI. If you buy a book on Amazon, it's mediated by AI. If you're in any form of social media, from TikTok to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, it's all mediated and tiled by AI. So AI is the means by which things are delivered now. And of course, it's far more complicated than that, because the first big wave really in AI was changing the very nature of the interface. We have, of course, this new Netflix interface that everybody knows. We've probably watched far too much of that during COVID, but it doesn't matter what streaming service you're on, that tiled horizontal scrolling and vertical scrolling has become a worldwide standard. Everybody knows it. And indeed, we're seeing that in the learning world now. So learning experience platforms, which are replacing LMSs, learning management systems, have that approach. But it's more than that, because in a funny sort of way, the interface can disappear. If you're learning, you don't really want an interface. You want the interface to be as invisible, the technology to be as invisible as possible, as Donald Norman said, that great guru in design. So, how do you make the interface disappear? Well, I have in this room an ALEXA. I won't say the word or she'll spring into action, but AI has given us voice interfaces, speech to text, text to speech. Not only does it sit behind all interfaces, deciding algorithmic what we need next, and I'll explain why that's important in learning, it has got rid of the interface in many cases, as in speech. Remember, most teachers talk to students, students talk back to them. So this Socratic notion of the primacy of speech in learning could certainly come back in a return. I think we see a sign of this in podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts. When I speak to learners, they also listen to podcasts. So I think that's a newer medium. Audio is much underrepresented in learning, I think, in online learning. But let's get really practical for a minute and rattle through some of the things that AI can be used for right now. So I've already said that AI is the new UI, the new user interface, mediating what you say on the screen. The second big one is search, of course. So if you're searching for anything online, you're using AI, but searchability is becoming even more important. You're now finding with deep learning management systems, if you're stuck and you want to know something in a topic on engineering or physics or chemistry or whatever, then we're finding that search should be able to go inside the documents in your institution, even crawl inside the videos using the transcript as data, so that you can pluck out the little bit of video that's just relevant to you at that moment. So rather than delivering huge chunks of learning, which you're almost inevitably going to forget, you have this detailed searchability of the content, which helps learners. Whenever they get stuck, they can find exactly what they need, because modern search goes inside video, inside the documentation, to find what they need. This is what learning experience platforms do. They just, they satisfy the moment of need, not the teacher's a normal behavior in lecturing. So when AI comes to teachers, it's definitely not a case of AI replacing teachers. I don't think that's likely to happen. It's almost, and also this idea of robot teachers. I've seen a lot of that at conference. This is nonsense, of course. Robot teachers are completely beside the point. You wouldn't have a robot driver in a self-driving car, so you don't need a robot teacher in a learning system. It just doesn't make any sense at all. The system itself has all the intelligence and smartness. So AI in that sense isn't a threat. It's just a powerful teaching and learning tool used to help teachers and faculty in future teaching. I think an interesting example is in learner support. If we go across the learner journey and start with just giving students support, and there's a now famous example at Georgia Tech where they had 350 AI students. So these are smart students, straight A in maths type kids. And they had nine teaching assistants on the course to support all the assignments and so on. And they swapped one of those out with a piece of software, which was an AI chatbot, actually, designed by Georgia Tech. And none of the students guessed. None of them spotted that it was a piece of software. Remember, these are AI students. In fact, they put it up for a teaching award, crazy as that may seem, because it was fast, consistent, and absolutely served their needs 24/7. If you're on your assignment at 1 o'clock in the morning, you will not get an email from faculty, but you will get an answer from the system. In fact, it was so efficient, so fast, that they had to slow it down to make it look as though somebody was typing. So it's actually better than a human in that sense. In year two, they had two assistants, and some of the students thought that the humans were pieces of software, and some thought that the software were humans. People were getting completely confused as to whether this was real or not, showing that at the level of learner support, this stuff really does work. Excuse me. And then there's the big one, and that's adaptive learning. This, in a sense, is what Duolingo does. It personalizes the learning for every single student. So rather than batching 100 students in a lecture hall through to a one-size-fits-all type curriculum and model, we now have software. I've been involved in building this software on a big system over 5 years. That was 20, 30 programmers in India for 3 or 4 years. This is sophisticated software using AI, and it networks the knowledge. And as you go through the course, every student goes through the course in a different vector, a different route. And if you get stuck, it's a bit like the sat nav in your car. If you're driving from Delft to Maastricht and you take the wrong turning, then your sat nav will get you back on course. Well, this software does exactly the same thing for students in maths, statistics, physics, whatever. If you suddenly get stuck, it will make sure that you go through the right sort of teaching at that precise moment to get you back on course. And that particular platform had an investment of $1 million from Arizona State University. They liked it so much. It's very unusual, a university putting real money into software. And it's just been bought completely for cash by Cambridge University. Now, why did Cambridge University buy an AI-driven adaptive personalized learning platform? Because they're smart, I think. They see that universities now have less than 20% of the adult education market, and it's falling as MOOCs, Coursera, other players come into the market here. And I think when you look at what these other people are doing here, they're starting to use these very, very smart AI-driven platforms. So watch out for adaptive learning experience platforms. And then the technology, AI technology itself is really, really progressing fast. So if you haven't heard of a thing called GTP3, then you should. Honestly, have a look in Google, because this is an astounding piece of AI technology that basically can write an essay by simply asking it a question. And if you don't think that's true, have a go or look at the examples on their website. So GPT-2 could already, the famous example was, what were the causes of the American Civil War? You press the button, woof, it produces an essay. And it's a readable essay. GTP3, the next version, is much bigger, much better trained, more parameters, and can not only create fresh essays, escaping plagiarism checkers, interestingly, it can also create questions. So if you're creating content, so over the last year or two, we've been creating content, summarizing, doing all sorts of things with GTP3, using extremely smart software to create learning experiences and content. That's coming into the market as well. And then AI, some more leading edge things here. There's a thing called sentiment analysis. In other words, understanding the subjective feelings of the student. Motivation is a big deal in learning. Teachers, by and large, are setting the context for students to learn. It's not a sort of pour like a cup the knowledge into the brain of the student. All learning is student driven. Cognitively, we construct knowledge. We do not get it decanted into our brains. But sentiment analysis can give you a feel as to whether the students are feeling as though they're failing or what they're having trouble with. So we've been using this, if you gather the data in the social type aspects of a platform, you can quickly tell whether students are struggling or not. And there are cases where students have had serious mental health problems where intervention has come through this data. So I think we're seeing sentiment analysis creeping into the equation as well, which is nice, I think. And then the big one, of course, is all of this is driven by data. I mean, any modern solution in learning has to be data driven. Every other area of human endeavor is now recognizing that science and data really matters. And in artificial intelligence, it really does matter because it's the data that trains the models and continuously allows the model to improve as it goes off into the future. Now that the great danger here is that systems just use data at a descriptive or just analysis level, and then you get lots of these dashboards. I'm sure you've seen lots of those, donuts, histograms, pie charts. This is a bit of a dead end because actually it's all about decision making. And good AI, you never see a donut or a pie chart on Netflix or social media for the user because it doesn't make any sense. Users want things automated. And so rather than description or analysis, AI is really rather cleverly being used now for prediction. And I was predicting where the learner will go wrong, what they need to know next, what exactly do you need to present and resequence in this learning experience for that individual, or even better, prescription or automation of a process, which is what Netflix, Amazon, and everybody else does with AI. In other words, it automates the things behind the scenes to make things better for you as a learner. So description, analysis, prediction, prescription, automation is the sort of curve. The further up your curve you go, the more mature you are in using your data. And then at the end of this learning journey, let's not forget assessment, because by and large, I found that faculty, I was at a conference in Berlin recently, and I didn't meet an academic yet who didn't hate proctoring, but I don't know why they hate proctoring. My son, who had to have proctored exams in his degree, loved it, because he could do his exam in England. He didn't have to go back. He did a degree in the Netherlands. He didn't have to go back to the Netherlands during COVID because he couldn't, and he found proctoring straightforward. So I think this idea of freeing up assessment so that you can take an exam any place, anytime is a great thing. Why should we have to wait a year? In many universities, if you fail just one course, you have to go a whole year again to sit the course in the next year because the exam is not available. Then there's plagiarism checking, and I mean we've been using AI to create assessments in a tool called Wildfire, where the assessment is open input. You actually type the answers in, and the AI semantically interprets your answer. So this is getting clever now. It's not just multiple choice, which is a horrible aspect. And the multiple choice question, the answer is already there on the screen, and really smart people can start to second guess. If you simply have open input where you're typing in your answer, then you have AI that interprets that answer. Then you're really making progress and moving away from multiple choice as an assessment item. So right across this learning journey here, from learner support to motivation to personalized learning to actual teaching, the creation of content, the curation of content, going out into the web and finding something that's useful for you, right through to assessment, this whole journey is being helped by AI at every step. Now, whenever I give a talk on AI, the first question is always on ethics. I don't know why this is really, because to be honest, AI is maybe not as good as you think and not as bad as you fear. I don't think it's coming after us anytime soon. That's not to say that there are no ethical issues. There are ethical issues such as bias, transparency, race, gender, the dehumanization of the process. These all have to be addressed. But there's one thing I would like to address straight off, and that's that, the accusation of bias or racism or whatever, sexism in AI is sometimes a bit unfair. It's a bit like anthropomorphism, reading into AI things that are not there. This is very, very common, I think, which is on a grander scale. I think if you understand that AI has to learn, it's a machine learning process, a lot of it, not all, but a lot of it, and that it has to improve and it has to go through various stages of improvement. Of course, it might do odd things, like the famous example of the hand sanitizer. So you put your hand beneath the thing, it has a photoelectric cell in it, and it recognizes if your hand's gone in. And of course, sometimes it wasn't recognizing people with darker colored hands. But that was just a matter of calibration. I mean, it wasn't as if the machine was being racist. That's a ridiculous proposition. It's not even, to be honest, that the people who designed the teams were being racist. It's just that once the thing gets all its use cases into place, then it becomes better. And so Steven Pinker famously thinks that, like engineers understand this, we don't have ethics applied to everything historically. Engineers test systems exhaustively before release, and we have safety rules and laws, and the same in pharmaceuticals, and the same will be true in AI. You know, any overfitting or glitches is a design problem, an engineering problem. So, on the grander scale, this is why many people like Steven Pinker say, well, it's not this idea that it's an existential threat to our species is completely wrong-headed because we are in control. We simply engineer it not to be. So, if anybody's got any questions, we can go into detail on any one of those issues. I mean, the idea, for example, that it's just a bunch of white kids in a room creating this AI and therefore it's all wrong. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to Silicon Valley, but I've yet to see an all-white programming team. There's usually a couple of Indian kids, a Chinese kid. It's a very multicultural endeavor. This one. It's odd, really. I was thinking, I don't drive. I've never driven a car. And I'm always amazed that people never apply ethics to the driving of that wonder of engineering, the motor car, because 1.5 million people every year die horrible deaths from car accidents. But we're not applying the same moral standards to that as we are to AI. All the attention is on AI, but have we ever thought for a minute that there's almost a world war level of casualties every single year because cars, and the AI will bring in self-driving cars and solve that problem? So I think the ethical attention should be maybe on both the good and bad. It's so often just focusing on the bad on AI, and I think we can leave this to big international organizations like IEEE in engineering. They have a very good AI regulation and ethical committee, or the EU, or some of those bigger international bodies. I think there's far too many people involved in universities on writing frameworks and long lists of things that we shouldn't be doing. I mean, my favorite example is transparency. I see this quite often. They say all algorithms for use in our university have to be totally transparent. Well, you're going to have to shut down Google Scholar. You're going to have to stop all those things because they're proprietary algorithms. They are not transparent. The important thing about AI in that context is that it's competent. AI is competence without consciousness. It doesn't have to know anything. It just has to be good at what it does. If AI can spot tumors on an X-ray or an MRI scan to a higher standard than human beings, then why not? Why would we allow people to die? So I think this is about looking at the utilitarian purposes of this and relaxing a little bit about the low-hanging fruit and the good cases. Now, let me end on one thing, which is just this final frontier here. Let's look ahead a little bit because some amazing things are happening. And if there's one thing that will give you an idea where this is going, have a look at Neuralink's Pager video. Pager was a 9-year-old primate, a monkey, who was playing a computer game. The video is astounding. And it was getting a banana milkshake reward for playing the game. Then, with a joystick, they suddenly switched the joystick off, pulled the plug on the joystick because they had an array of fibers in the primate's brain. It continued playing the game to a high level of competence just by interpreting the data, using AI to interpret the monkey's brain data. Now, this is targeted at paraplegics, quadriplegics, stroke victims, people with locked-in syndrome, and so on. But they're now looking at deafness, blindness, ADHD, addiction, depression, even now. But think for a moment about that reading data from the brain. This thing also looks as though it can have the ability to write back to the brain. It's a mixture of engineering problems, high-end AI. But imagine a future where learning is actually using invasive or non-invasive other techniques like EEG or reflected laser light and so on that are being used as well. And then a wonderful thing, I think, is Starlink, which is about 4,800 low orbit satellites that will provide 5G internet access to anywhere on the planet. Anywhere on the planet, no blind spots. This will allow us to deliver AI personalized learning to every single child, adult, anywhere on planet Earth. This is the way the future is going. Okay. So I think as AI takes on a stronger supporting role for teachers going forward, so that teachers can focus on higher level learning, all those 101 basic courses can be delivered using these platforms. We have the proof that that can be the case. With the pendulum swinging towards learner autonomy, freeing people from the tyranny of time and place, time shifting everything so it's available at any time, 24/7, 365 days a year. We're seeing these platforms arise already. So I'll finish there because no doubt we may want some questions here. So thank you very much for listening, but I hope that was useful. And if anyone has any questions, then please.